Okay, very good. Little talk for the YouTube video people. Today we're continuing our reading of the Dubliners. We're going to start with a story called The Boarding House, and then the second story is A Little Cloud. So that being said, I will begin the reading. The Boarding House. Mrs. Mooney was a butcher's daughter. She was a woman who was quite able to keep things to herself, a determined woman. She had married her father's foreman and opened a butcher shop near Spring Gardens. But as soon as his father-in-law was dead, Mr. Mooney began to go to the devil. He drank, plundered the till, ran headlong into debt. It was no use making him take the pledge. He was sure to break out again in a few days after. By fighting his wife in the presence of customers and by buying bad meat, he ruined his business. One night he went for his wife with a cleaver, and she had to sleep in the neighbor's house. After that, they lived apart. She went to the priest and got a separation from him with care for the children. She would give him neither money nor food nor house room, and so he was obliged to enlist himself as a sheriff's man. He was a shabby, stooped little drunkard with a white face and a white mustache and white eyebrows penciled above his little eyes, which were pink-veined and raw. And all day long he sat in the bailiff's room waiting to be put on the job. Mrs. Mooney, who had taken what remained of her money out of the butcher business and set up a boarding house in Hardwick Street, was a big, imposing woman. Her house had a floating population made up of tourists from Liverpool and the Isle of Man, and occasionally artistes from the music halls. Its resident population was made up of clerks from the city. She governed her house cunningly and firmly, knew when to give credit, when to be stern, and when to let things pass. All the resident young men spoke of her as the madam. Next, please.
Mrs. Mooney's young men paid 15 shillings a week for board and lodgings, beer or stout at dinner excluded. They shared in common tastes and occupations, and for this reason they were very chummy with one another. They discussed with one another the chances of favourites and outsiders. Jack Mooney, the madam's son, who was clerk to a commission agent in Fleet Street, had the reputation of being a hard case. He was fond of using soldiers' obscenities. Usually he came home in the small hours. When he met his friends, he'd always a good one to tell them, and he was always sure to be on to a good thing, that is to say, a likely horse or a likely artiste. He was also handy with the mitts and sang comic songs. On Sunday nights, there would often be a reunion in Mrs. Mooney's front drawing room. The music hall artiste would oblige, and Sheridan played waltzes and polkas and vamped accompaniments. Polly Mooney, the madam's daughter, would also sing. She sang, "I'm a naughty girl, you needn't sham, you know I am." Polly was a slim girl of 19. She had a light, soft hair and a small, full mouth. Her eyes, which were grey with a shade of green through them, had a habit of glancing upwards when she spoke with anyone, which made her look like a little perverse Madonna. Next.
Mrs. Mooney had first sent her daughter to be a typist in a corn factor's office, but as a disreputable sheriff's man used to come every other day to the office asking to be allowed to say a word to his daughter, she had taken her daughter home again and set her to do housework. As Polly was very lively, the intention was to give her the run of the young men. Besides, young men like to feel that there is a young woman not very far away. Polly, of course, flirted with the young men, but Mrs. Mooney, who was a shrewd judge, knew that the young men were only passing the time away. None of them meant business. Things went on so for a long time, and Mrs. Mooney began to think of sending Polly back to typewriting, and she noticed that something was going on between Polly and one of the young men. She watched the pair and kept her own counsel. Polly knew that she was being watched, but still her mother's persistent silence could not be misunderstood. There had been no complicity between mother and daughter, no open understanding, but though people in the house began to talk of the affair, still Mrs. Mooney did not intervene. Polly began to grow a little strange in her manner, and the young man was evidently perturbed. At last, when she judged it to be the right moment, Mrs. Mooney intervened. She dealt with moral problems as a cleaver deals with meat. And in this case, she had made up her mind. It was a bright Sunday morning of early summer, promising heat, but with a fresh breeze blowing. All the windows of the boarding house were open, and the lace curtains ballooned gently towards the street beneath the raised sashes. Anne.
Okay. The belfry of George's church sent out constant peals, and worshippers, singly or in groups, traversed the little circus before the church, revealing their purpose by their self-contained demur, no less than by the little volumes in their gloved hands. Breakfast was over in the boarding house, and the table of the breakfast room was covered with plates on which lay yellow streaks of eggs, with morsels of bacon fat and bacon rind. Mrs. Mooney sat in the straw armchair and watched the servant, Mary, remove the breakfast things. She made Mary collect the crusts and pieces of broken bread to help to make Tuesday's bread pudding. Oh, God. When the table was cleared, the broken bread collected, the sugar and butter safe under lock and key, she began to reconstruct the interview which she had had the night before with Polly. Things were as she had suspected. She had been frank in her questions, and Polly had been frank in her answers. Both had been somewhat awkward, of course, but she had been made awkward by her not wishing to receive the news in too cavalier a fashion, or to seem to have connived when Polly had been made awkward, not merely because allusions of that kind always made her awkward, but also because she did not wish it to be thought that in her wise innocence she had divined the intention behind her mother's tolerance. Next, please. Trina.
Mrs. Mooney glanced instinctively at the little gilt clock on the mantelpiece as soon as she had become aware through her reverie that the bells of St. George's Church had stopped ringing. It was 17 minutes past 11. She would have lots of time to have the matter out with Mr. Doran, and then catch short 12 at Marlborough Street. She was sure she would win. To begin with, she had all the weight of social opinion on her side. She was an outraged mother. She had allowed him to live beneath her roof, assuming that he was a man of honor, and he had simply abused her hospitality. He was 34 or 35 years of age, so that youth could not be pleaded as his excuse, nor could ignorance be his excuse, since he was a man who had seen something of the world. He had simply taken advantage of Polly's youth and inexperience. That was evident. The question was, what reparations would he make? There must be reparations made in such cases. It is all very well for the man. He can go his ways as if nothing had happened, having had his moments of pleasure, but the girl has to bear the brunt. Some mothers would be content to patch up such an affair for a sum of money. She had known cases of it, but she would not do so, for her only reparation could make up for the loss of her daughters. for her, only one reparation could make up for the loss of her daughter's honor, marriage. Next, please.
She counted all her cards again before sending Mary up to Mr. Durand's room to say that she wished to speak with him. She felt sure she would win. He was a serious young man, not rakish or loud-mouthed like the others. If it had been Mr. Sheridan or Mr. Meade or Bantam Lyons, her task would have been much harder. She did not think he would face publicity. All the lodgers in the house knew something of the affair. Details had been invented by some. Besides, he had been employed for 13 years in a great Catholic wine merchant's office, and publicity would mean for him, perhaps, the loss of his sit. Whereas, if he agreed, all might be well. She knew he had a good screw, for one thing, and she suspected he had a bit of stuff put by. Nearly the half hour. She stood up and surveyed herself in the pier glass. The decisive expression of her great florid face satisfied her, and she thought of some mothers she knew who could not get their daughters off their hands. Mr. Durand was very anxious indeed this Sunday morning. He had made 2 attempts to shave by his hand, but his hand had been so unsteady that he had been obliged to desist. 3 days' reddish beard fringed his jaws, and every 2 or 3 minutes a mist gathered on his glasses, so that he had to take them off and polish them with his pocket handkerchief. The recollection of his confession of the night before was a cause of acute pain to him. The priest had drawn out every ridiculous detail of the affair, and in the end had so magnified his sin that he was almost thankful at being afforded a loophole of reparation. Harm was done. What could he do now but marry her or run away? He could not brazen it out. The affair would be sure to be talked of, and his employer would be certain to hear of it. Dublin is such a small city. Everyone knows everyone else's business. He felt his heart leap warmly in his throat as he heard in his excited imagination old Mr. Leonard calling out in his rasping voice, "Send Mr. Durand here, please." Next.
Okay, Anna Mouse, are you ready by any chance?
You have to unmute, Anna.
Okay, I will assume that you're not ready. If you do get ready at some point, let me know. All his long years of service gone for nothing. All his industry and diligence thrown away. As a young man, he had sown his wild oats, of course. He had boasted of his free thinking and denied the existence of God to his companions in public houses. But that was all past and done with, nearly. He still bought a copy of Reynolds' newspaper every week, but he attended to his religious duties and for 9/10 of the year lived a regular life. He had money enough to settle down on. It was not that. But the family would look down on her. First of all, there was her disreputable father, and then her mother's boarding house was beginning to get a certain fame. He had a notion that he was being had. You can imagine his friends talking of the affair and laughing. She was a little vulgar. Sometimes she said, "I seen," and "if I'd have known." But what would grammar matter if he really loved her? He could not make up his mind whether to like her or despise her for what she had done. Of course, he had done it too. His instinct urged him to remain free, not to marry. Once you are married, you're done for, it said. Next.
While he was sitting helplessly on the side of the bed in shirt and trousers, she tapped lightly at his door and entered. She told him all, that she had made a clean breast of it to her mother, and that her mother would speak with him that morning. She cried and threw her arms round his neck, saying, oh, Bob, what am I to do? What am I to do at all?" She would put an end to herself, she said. He comforted her feebly, telling her not to cry, that it would be all right, never fear. He felt against his shirt the agitation of her bosom. It was not altogether his fault that it had happened. He remembered well, with the curious patient memory of the celibate, the first casual caresses her dress, her breath, her fingers had given him. Then late one night, as he was undressing for bed, she had tapped at his door timidly. She wanted to relight her candle at his, for hers had been blown out by a gust. It was her bath night. She wore a loose open combing jacket of printed flannel. Her white instep shone in the opening of her furry slippers, and the blood glowed warmly behind her perfumed skin. From her hands and wrists, too, as she lit and steadied her candle, a faint perfume arose. On nights when he came in very late, it was she who warmed up his dinner. He scarcely knew what he was eating, feeling her beside him alone at night in the sleeping house, and her thoughtfulness. If the night was anyway cold or wet or windy, there was sure to be a little tumbler of punch ready for him. Perhaps they could be happy together. Next.
They used to go upstairs together on tiptoe, each with a candle, and on the third landing exchange reluctant good nights. They used to kiss. He remembered well her eyes, the touch of her hand, and his delirium. But delirium passes. He echoed her phrase, applying it to himself. What am I to do? The instinct of the celibate warned him to hold back, but sin was there. Even his sense of honor told him that reparation must be made for such a sin. While he was sitting with her on the side of the bed, Mary came to the door and said that the missus wanted to see him in the parlour. He started and put on his coated waistcoat, more helpless than ever. When he was dressed, he went over to her to comfort her. It'll be all right, never fear. He left her crying on the bed and moaning softly, "Oh my God." Going down the stairs, his glasses became so dimmed with moisture that he had to take them off and polish them. He longed to ascend through the roof and fly away to another country where he would never hear again of his trouble. And yet a force pushed him downstairs step by step. The implacable faces of his employer and of the madam stared upon his discomfiture. On the last flight of stairs, he passed Jack Mooney, who was coming up from the pantry nursing 2 bottles of Bass. They saluted coldly, and the lover's eyes rested for a second or two on the thick bulldog face and a pair of thick, short arms. When he reached the foot of the staircase, he glanced up and saw Jack regarding him from the door of the return room. Suddenly he remembered the night when one of the music hall artistes, a little blonde Londoner, had made a rather free allusion to Polly. The reunion had been almost broken up on account of Jack's violence. Everyone tried to quiet him. The music hall artiste, a little paler than usual, kept smiling and saying that there was no harm meant, but Jack kept shouting at him that if any fella tried that sort of a game on with his sister, he'd bloody well put his teeth down his throat, so he would.
Okay. Polly sat for a little time on the side of the bed crying. Then she dried her eyes and went over to the looking glass. She dipped the end of the towel in the water jug and refreshed her eyes with the cool water. She looked at herself in profile and readjusted a hairpin above her ear. Then she went back to the bed again and sat at the foot. She regarded the pillows for a long time, and the sight of them awakened in her mind secret, amicable memories. She rested the nape of her neck against the cool iron bed rail and fell into a reverie. There was no longer any perturbation visible on her face. She waited on patiently, almost cheerfully, without alarm. her memories gradually giving place to hopes and visions of the future. Her hopes and visions were so intricate that she no longer saw the white pillows on which her gaze was fixed or remembered that she was waiting for anything. At last she heard her mother calling. She started to her feet and ran to the banisters. Polly, Polly, yes, Mamma. Come down, dear. Mr. Doran wants to speak to you. And then she remembered what she had been waiting for. There now. Poor old Bob.
Oh, Bob is one of my favorite characters in Joyce.
Yeah, he is funny.
Or a party Kieran's on a
Yeah, so funny. You could actually just absolutely see him falling off the stool and everything inside
Yeah.
Barney Kieran's book.
Oh, yes, I'd love to participate as him one day in a Bloomsday theatre, you know.
Oh,
The only person he talks to is the dog.
yeah.
Some commentator said that Bob being drunk in the Barney Kieran's, the way he was carrying on. He said, "I wouldn't wonder,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but you could see the situation there that he works he works for a wine importer of Catholic wine importer. So presumably they supplied the church with altar wine. So
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
his job is so on the line, and he's in his mid-30s.
Yeah. The relationship with their bosses was so completely different, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, but like the priest wouldn't no longer buy wine there. You see, if they had an immoral character to, sitting there working as a clerk.
Even when Mrs. Mooney was going for the separation, she went to the priest to get it sorted.
Oh yeah. Yeah, she's an organizer.
Not the solicitor, the priest.
The other thing I really like the very first line of that story. Mrs. Mooney was a butcher's daughter, full stop.
Yeah, it's dealt with this moral issue as you would with me.
A keeper deals with me.
Yeah.
I underlined that. That was so funny.
But there seems to be a sort of an issue with people staying in boarding houses, and that Gertie McDowell and Berta Supple tells her the story of the man from the Congestion District Board who was showing her photographs or whatever. There was a sort of evidence. There was a select committee of the British Parliament met on contagious diseases in Dublin. There's quotations from it that indicate that the streets were not a place where people would walk at night, and that boarding houses seem to be just a step up from that.
Yeah.
And then the boarding house is a play on the word boarding, to you get that in Shakespeare, in Twelfth Night, to Sir Toby Belch to Sir Andrew Aguecheek, board her, sir, board her, So it means to, chat her up, sort of thing. So,
I think the boarding, the very idea that particularly a boarding house which is run by a widow, and implication being that they're so desperate for money that they will take strangers into their house. And this was all, this is almost a universal type thing. I remember one time I was offered a house in Dallas, Texas, which originally had been a very fancy street. But during the Depression, it had descended into, it had big houses on the street, but it descended into the boarding house world. because the people who own the houses could no longer afford the taxes or their payments, and so they would bring in boarders, day laborers, and this sort of thing. And so the street had gone down, but those days were over, and it was starting to rise back up again.
Yeah, yeah.
And people with money were coming in and rebuying the houses and renovating them because they were gorgeous houses.
Oh, yeah, yeah. They had the money to do the repairs and renovations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, same
Exactly.
cycle follows here. Uh,
Hmm.
so what happened to you? You were offered this. Did you go for it?
No, I was all of 26 or 27 and couldn't imagine myself being tied down
But which property
to
does?
with payments, even though it was very cheap at the time. So I decided instead of doing that, I would go to Japan.
Yeah, as one does.
So,
But the brother Jack there, what's he, the malicious narrator Cyclops says that her Polly's brother Jack said she'd kick the shite out of him if he didn't
Yeah.
watch. Sorry.
His
mhm.
father's son. He's his father's son.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, right.
But I
And
would.
I was laughing at one thing. I don't think Bob Doran's interview with Mrs. Mooney wouldn't be as bad as the part when he went to his confession the night before. The recollection of his confession of the night before was a cause of acute pain for him. The
Yeah.
priest had drawn out every ridiculous detail of the affair and in the had magnified it.
Yeah, well, you see, and that has to be seen through the lens of his employer hearing this from a priest.
Yeah,
So
that's
that
so
you're
funny.
financing immorality. He can't possibly give you the orders again unless he was to leave. You can just like he's surrounded. I love the
He
Yes, yeah,
is he is
fly up
surrounded.
to the roof
Yes,
and
yes.
go somewhere
And he
else.
yeah.
he knows it. I am not a Catholic, so and I've never gone to confession. But I would have to wonder if, in addition to confessing one's own sins, if sometimes people didn't use it as a way to complain about something happening in their life with somebody else.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Like, whether Mrs. Mooney had already inadvertently talked to the priest during confession about how upset she was
yeah,
about her daughter's behavior with one of the boarders.
yeah, yeah. Well,
I don't even know if that's possible, but
okay, completely possible because it's very hard to say. Well, myself and another fellow robbed a bank, and how do you explain? You say, well, it was his idea, not mine. I just drove the car. And it's very hard for the priest not to find out what the other person was, even without
mhm,
asking. And
mhm, mhm.
so a fantastic tool of social control, if you think about it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if that's your thing, but Joyce has a huge problem with confession. Possibly, I'm not sure exactly when this was written, but the introduction of confession for young people by Pope Pius X, which meant 7-year-olds had to go into the dark box, and it was one of the things that was a big influence. He felt this was very wrong. And well,
What year?
you get that portrait. In portrait, you get that terrible, ridiculous confession.
Yeah.
A young boy has been asked where they married women,
Mhm,
and he makes fun of it. But that was one of that priest at the start of the Father Flynn, in the confession. In a way, the sisters is this was the end. It was the third stroke that the
mhm.
priest, who was in the confession box in that episode, he stands for the church. And the banning of women from choirs was the first stroke. The papal infallibility ex cathedra was the second stroke, and then the confession for young people and who previously, I think you had to be 14 years of age previous or something like that for confession. They were the three strokes of that Joyce is referring to there. The very opening.
What year did that happen? To where
they happened at 3 different years. I'm not sure of the one on the confessional. It may have come later, but still in time to be inserted for publication. I think that was around 1910.
okay.
And they were all the works of Pius X, Saint. So yeah, that's just like kind of background reading I was doing myself.
Yeah, but that's very interesting.
Yeah, but
it's exceedingly interesting because, of course, if you start, I mean, it's a really practical thing if you want a lot of control to have people starting to confess, because the implication is if you have to confess, then you should feel guilty about these things.
Yeah.
And that you are capable of sin. And, you take your average 7-year-old, and that's a heavy burden.
Yeah, you see, and you kind of you think up sins that you could get away with,
Oh yeah.
It's like I cursed, father, and like in school, you're going to your school teachers to confession. You know who they are. You know their voices.
Right.
And all that. You don't want to say, well, I sort of, I shot a man last week, father. I'm 7 years of age. You have to think up stuff you're going to get 2 Hail Marys for, and you get away with it, and you're out of it. But it's nonsense,
I think Molly recalls going to confession, doesn't she?
Oh yeah. And where did he touch you, my dear?
Yes. And the bank.
Yeah.
Where on your person?
Yeah.
That was so funny.
Yeah.
But
Do anybody know what Reynolds' newspaper was?
Oh no.
He still bought a copy of Reynolds' newspaper every week, but it must have been banned.
What?
But he attended.
Where?
I don't.
I have a note in my volume. Reynolds newspaper, a radical London Sunday newspaper which reported on scandalous events.
Yeah. Yeah. Started in 1850. It's a four-penny report of social and political scandals. From a conservative point of view, its politics were, quote unquote, rude. And Reynolds was characterized as a formidable spokesman for the most irreconcilable portions of the community. So it's a naughty newspaper.
Yeah, because he says, well, this will tell us what he's going to be like in Ulysses, because he bought it every week, but he attended to his religious duties and for 9/10 of the year lived a regular life. So obviously for the other bit, then he went on a bender.
Yeah. God bless him.
Oh, it's hilarious.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, this whole story is constructed in such a humorous manner, and yet a lot of the humor is based upon the reader feeling, God, I'm glad I'm not Bob Doran.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That this is you can see the trap. You can see the forces closing in on it.
And it must have been a scandalous story at the time of writing, because it's just, like you get a daughter and mother engineering, get how to get rid of your daughters,
Mm-hmm.
How do you have to pay a dowry usually. She's saving on the dowry here,
Mm-hmm.
And all these kind of thoughts, and it's just a little bit too close to the bone in reality. And I'm thinking of Harriet Weaver reading this, and who was opposed to marriage as a concept for men or women. And she'd say, "Yeah, this guy, I like the way he writes."
Uh, well, I like the part where when the mother is originally talking to Polly, and I forget the expression that's used, but basically Polly has to answer the question in such a manner that she can also pretend that she's not part of the plot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That phrase, wise innocence.
Wise innocence. There it goes. Wise
Yeah,
innocence.
yeah, it's a fabulous phrase, but I mean, the way Joyce,
Oh, there it is.
he's got inside each character's head there in the story, and it's fabulous. Yeah,
I can imagine someone telling Joyce a story like this uh,
Mm,
at some point, sitting around drinking someplace
yeah.
or just at a social event. I can imagine like his father uh, telling him a story of this nature.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I just looked that up. That's a great one. See if it features. Uh, boarding. Big index.
I think they lived in Hardwick Street for a while when they moved from Black Rock.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. The Joyces did.
Okay, and that's where this boarding
Yeah,
house is.
yeah, and of course he mentions the church there, George's church, that
Mm-hmm.
looms large in Ulysses as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The bells, yeah. The other thing I'm just
Mm-hmm.
thinking now is how she left it. Like Mr. Mooney said, I have half an hour. That's plenty of time to deal with Mr. Doran. I'll
Yeah.
get I'll get
Short
there's two masses going on in the Pro Cathedral. One was the short mass, and one was the longer one. And the short mass, people used to go into it and just get out fast. Yeah, but just the way she just calculated matter of factly.
Yeah,
I have
cold.
plenty of time. Yeah,
This is cold-blooded business going on here.
yeah,
And if you think of the I can't remember what time it was, but there was a lot of bells to ring for the time that he mentions.
Oh, it was 11.
11 something, yeah.
11.
11
17 minutes past 11.
So so the 11 would have had the hi ho so many times, and then 11 tongues.
yeah.
That's a lot of bell ringing. There's nothing in Elman to tie it in that I can just lay my finger on. He doesn't give you the stories one after the other in the index. You have to kind of rip them out. So I'll look another time.
Okay.
Point.
Has there been anyone who has written a book or a long essay piece on I mean, I know Joyce is the author of these stories, but as we know with Buckley, the Russian general, and as we know in Finnegan's Wake with the story about, being accosted in the park by the cad, that a lot of these stories came pretty directly from his father, which
Yeah.
he took and he embellished for his own purposes. So I just wonder, I mean, if there's like been a book on the Dubliners that talks about the possible sources of the stories, the bare bones that then get embellished.
Well, the main one that I know of is Elman, the biography, and you find that, for instance, Donna last time we were going around mentioned that the Evelina did actually get married to a sailor, and it's in Elman, the story and naming the person involved. But it's quite different in that her mother didn't die. Her mother actually outlived Evelyn, and he married a sailor, but there was never any question of him going abroad. You know, so you can see what the point you're making, Duncan, is how he took a little story and built
and built on it. Right, right.
and everything around it. And I'm sure there's probably an equivalent in there. And the best thing to do is get Elman and read a bit of it in bed every night.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I read it once years ago, and I've been avoiding opening it again.
Yeah.
But the idea of reading it a little bit at night is the thing to do. But I'm saying, like in Shakespeare, you know, I mean, it's really a revelation to a young reader of literature to realize that Shakespeare pretty much went out and took all these old stories from here and there and everywhere, and then he just embellished them for his own purposes.
Oh yeah, and characters that he knew, and Friar Lawrence, you know, in Romeo and Juliet, who messes with plants and poisons and things, you know, was something like 20 paces away from the house where he was boarding. There was a little former monastery where there was a garden like that where they had exotic plants. So literally on the way, walking around the block, he saw all these interesting plants, and former monks who still could talk about them. Oh, this is what you take to cure a cough, and this cures a sore ear, and mix those two together and you'll sleep. You know, these kind of things. And he writes Friar Lawrence into the death sleep draft for Juliet. You know, it completely takes.
Okay. Yeah.
So be careful if you're friendly with a writer, because he's probably working you into some terrible plot.
Well,
something just funny just happened there. I took down my Richard Ellman as well because I must have a look. I was avoiding him. And you know what I was using as a bookmark the last time I read it was the Irish £10 note with Joyce.
I was going to say a £50 note. Yeah.
A tenner.
It's a while.
They must have been good days when I was using a tenner.
Yeah, that's like you're in the car with a $50 note.
I was like, what is that?
It's probably worth more.
I was using it. Oh no, but we'd never get rid of Joyce. No, we'd hold on to him. It was just funny. I was like, what is that? Tells you how long ago. I can't remember when they were in circulation.
2002. They were the Euro.
Okay. Oh, okay. When we went changed over.
Yeah.
When you changed over the euro, right?
Yeah.
Perfect.
So perhaps in view of the time, we should move on to the Two Gallants, which is no, A Little Cloud. Excuse me.
The Cloud, yeah.
Yeah, which is a little longer story.
Yeah.
So, who was the last reader? Who finished up this?
I finished.
You finished.
So yeah. So it's Katrina.
It's me.
Hey, Katrina, take it away.
A Little Cloud. 8 years before he had seen his friend off at the North Wall and wished him Godspeed, Gallagher had got on. You could tell that at once by his traveled air, his well-cut tweed suit, and fearless accent. Few fellows had talents like his, and fewer still could remain unspoiled by such success. Gallagher's heart was in the right place, and he had deserved to win. It was something to have a friend like that. Little Chandler's thoughts ever since lunchtime had been of his meeting with Gallagher, of Gallagher's invitation, and of the great city London where Gallagher lived. He was called Little Chandler because, though he was but slightly under the average stature, he gave one the idea of being a little man. His hands were white and small, his frame was fragile, his voice was quiet, and his manners refined. He took the greatest care of his fair silken hair and mustache, and used perfume discreetly on his handkerchief. The half moons of his nails were perfect, and when he smiled, you caught a glimpse of a now childish white teeth, of a row of childish white teeth. Next, please.
As he sat at his desk in the King's Inns, he thought what changes those 8 years had brought. The friend whom he had known under a shabby and necessitous guise had become a brilliant figure on the London press. He turned often from his tiresome writing to gaze out of the office window. The glow of a late autumn sunset covered the grass plots and walks. It cast a shower of kindly golden dust on the untidy nurses and decrepit old men who drowsed on the benches. It flickered upon all the moving figures, on the children who ran screaming along the gravel paths, and on everyone who passed through the gardens. He watched the scene and thought of life. And, as always happened when he thought of life, he became sad. A gentle melancholy took possession of him. He felt how useless it was to struggle against fortune, this being the burden of wisdom which the ages had bequeathed to him. He remembered the books of poetry upon his shelves at home. He had bought them in his bachelor days, and many an evening, as he sat in the little room off the hall, he had been tempted to take one down from the bookshelf and read out something to his wife. But shyness had always held him back, and so the books had remained on their shelves. At times he repeated lines to himself, and this consoled him. When his hour had struck, he stood up and took leave of his desk and of his fellow clerks punctiliously. He emerged from under the feudal arch of the King's Inns, a neat, modest figure, and he walked swiftly down Henrietta Street. The gold of the sunset was waning, and the air had grown sharp. A horde of grimy children populated the street. They stood or ran in the roadway, or crawled up the steps before the gaping doors, or squatted like mice upon the thresholds. Little Chandler gave them no thought. He picked his way deftly through all that minute, vermin-like life, and under the shadow of the gaunt, spectral mansions in which the old nobility of Dublin had roistered. No memory of the past touched him, for his mind was full of a present joy. Next.
He had never been in Corliss's, but he knew the value of the name. He knew that people went there after the theater to eat oysters and drink liqueurs. He had heard that the writers there spoke French and German. Walking swiftly by at night, he had seen cabs drawn up before the door and richly dressed ladies, escorted by cavaliers, alight and enter quickly. They wore noisy dresses and many wraps. Their faces were powdered, and they caught up their dresses when they touched earth like alarmed Atalantas. He had always passed without turning his head to look. It was his habit to walk swiftly in the streets even by day, and whenever he found himself in the city late at night, he hurried on his way apprehensively and excitedly. Sometimes, however, he courted the causes of his fear. He chose the darkest and narrowest streets, and as he walked boldly forward, the silence that was spread about his footsteps troubled him. The wandering, silent figures troubled him, and at times the sound of a low, fugitive laughter made him tremble like a leaf. Next.
He turned to the right towards Capel Street. Ignatius Gallagher on the London press. Who would have thought it possible 8 years before? Still, now that he reviewed the past, little Chandler could remember many signs of the future greatness in his friend. People used to say that Ignatius Gallagher was wild. Of course, he did mix with a rakish set of fellows at that time, drank freely and borrowed money on all sides. In the end, he got mixed up in some shady affair, some money transaction. At least that was one version of his flight. But nobody denied him talent. There was always a certain something in Ignatius Gallagher that impressed you in spite of yourself. Even when he was out at elbows and at his wits' end for money, He kept up a bold face. Little Chandler remembered, and the remembrance brought a slight flush of pride to his cheek. One of Ignatius Gallagher's sayings when he was in a tight corner. "Half time now, boys," he used to say light-heartedly. "Where's my considering cap?" That was Ignatius Gallagher all out. And damn it, you couldn't but admire him for it. Next.
Little Chandler quickened his pace. For the first time in his life, he felt himself superior to the people he passed. For the first time, his soul revolted against the dull inelegance of Cable Street. There was no doubt about it. If you wanted to succeed, you had to go away. You could do nothing in Dublin. As he crossed Grattan Bridge, he looked down the river towards the lower quays and pitied the poor, stunted houses. They seemed to him a band of tramps huddled together along the river banks, their old coats covered with dust and soot, stupefied by the panorama of sunset, and waiting for the first chill of night to bid them arise, shake themselves, and be gone. He wondered whether he could write a poem to express his idea. Perhaps Gallagher might be able to get it into some London paper for him. Could he write something original? He was not sure what idea he wished to express, but the thought that a poetic moment had touched him took life within him like an infant hope. He stepped onward bravely. Every step brought him nearer to London, further from his own sober, inartistic life. A light began to tremble on the horizon of his mind. He was not so old, 32. His temperament might be said to be just at the point of maturity. There were so many different moods and impressions that he wished to express in verse. He felt them within him. He tried to weigh his soul to see if it was a poet's soul. Melancholy was the dominant note of his temperament, he thought, but it was a melancholy tempered by recurrences of faith and resignation and simple joy. If he could give expression to it in a book of poems, perhaps men would listen. He would never be popular, he saw that. He could not sway the crowd, but he might appeal to a little circle of kindred minds. The English critics, perhaps, would recognize him as one of the Celtic school by reason of the melancholy tone of his poems. Besides that, he would put in allusions. He began to invent sentences and phrases from the notice which his book would get. Mr. Chandler has the gift of easy and graceful verse. A wistful sadness pervades these poems, the Celtic note. It was a pity that his name was not more Irish-looking. Pity. It would be better to insert his mother's name before the surname. Thomas Malone Chandler, or better still, T. Malone Chandler. He'd speak to Gallagher about it. Anne.
He pursued his review so ardently that he passed his street and had to turn back. As he came near Corliss, his former agitation began to overmaster him, and he halted before the door in indecision. Finally, he opened the door and entered. The light and noise of the bar held him at the doorway for a few moments. He looked about him, but his sight was confused by the shining of many red and green wine glasses. The bar seemed to him to be full of people, and he felt that the people were observing him curiously. He glanced quickly to right and left, frowning slightly to make his errand appear serious. When his sight cleared a little, he saw that nobody had turned to look at him. And there, sure enough, was Ignatius Gallagher, leaning with his back against the counter and his feet planted far apart. "Hello, Tommy, old hero, here you are. What is it to be? What will you have?" "I'm taking whiskey. Better stuff than we get across the water. Soda, Lithia, no, mineral. I'm the same. Spoils the flavour. Here, garçon, bring us 2 halves and malt whiskey, like a good fellow. Well, and how have you been pulling along since I saw you last? Dear God, how old we're getting. Do you see any signs of aging in me? What? A little grey and thin on top. What? Next, please.
Ignatius Gallagher took off his hat and displayed a large, closely cropped head. His face was heavy, pale, and clean-shaven. His eyes, which were a bluish slate color, relieved his unhealthy pallor and shone out plainly above the vivid orange tie he wore. Between these rival features, the lips appeared very long and shapeless and colorless. He bent his head and felt with two sympathetic fingers the thin hair at the crown. Little Chandler shook his head as if denial. Ignatius Gallagher put on his hat again. It pulls you down, he said, press life, always hurry and scurry looking for copy and sometimes not finding it, and then always to have something new in your stuff. Damn proofs and printers, I say for a few days. I'm deuced glad I can tell you to get back to the old country. Does a fellow good a bit of a holiday? I feel a ton better since I landed again in dear, dirty Dublin. Here you are, Tommy. Water? Say when. Little Chandler allowed his whiskey to be very much diluted. You don't know what's good for you, my boy, said Ignatius Gallagher. I drink mine neat. I drink very little as a rule, said Little Chandler modestly. An odd half one or so when I meet any of the old crowd, that's all. Ah, well, said Ignatius Gallagher cheerfully, here's to us and to old times and old acquaintance. They clinked glasses and drank the toast. I met some of the old gang today, said Ignatius Gallagher. O'Hara seems to be in a bad way. What's he doing? Nothing, said Little Chandler. He's gone to the dogs. But Hogan has a good sir, hasn't he? Yes, he's in the Land Commission. I met him one night in London, and he seemed to be very flush. Poor O'Hara. Booze, I suppose. Next, please.
Other things, too, said Little Chandler shortly. Ignatius Gallagher laughed. Tommy, he said, I see you haven't changed an atom. You're the very same serious person that used to lecture me on Sunday mornings when I had a sore head and a fur on my tongue. You want to knock about a bit in the world. Have you never been anywhere, even for a trip? I've been to the Isle of Man, said Little Chandler. Ignatius Gallagher laughed. The Island of Man, he said. Go to London or Paris. Paris, for choice. That'd do you good. Have you seen Paris? I should think I have. I've knocked about there a bit. And is it really so beautiful as they say? Asked Little Chandler. He sipped a little of his drink while Ignatius Gallagher finished his boldly. Beautiful? Said Ignatius Gallagher, pausing on the word and on the flavor of his drink. It's not so beautiful, you know. Of course, it is beautiful, but it's the life of Paris. That's the thing. There's no city like Paris for gaiety, movement, excitement. Little Chandler finished his whiskey and, after some trouble, succeeded in catching the barman's eye. He ordered the same again. I've been to the Moulin Rouge, Ignatius Gallagher continued when the barman had removed their glasses, and I've been to all the Bohemian cafes. Hot stuff. Not for a pious chap like you, Tommy. Little Chandler said nothing until the barman returned with the two glasses. Then he touched his friend's glass lightly and reciprocated the former toast. He was beginning to feel somewhat disillusioned. Gallagher's accent and way of expressing himself did not please him. There was something vulgar in his friend, which he had not observed before. But perhaps it was only the result of living in London amid the bustle and competition of the press. The only personal charm was still there under this new gaudy manner. And after all, Gallagher had lived. He had seen the world. Little Chandler looked at his friend enviously. Next, please.
Everything in Paris is gay, said Ignatius Gallagher. They believe in enjoying life. And don't you think they're right? If you want to enjoy yourself properly, you must go to Paris. And mind you, they've a great feeling for the Irish there. When they heard I was from Ireland, they were ready to eat me, man. Little Chandler took 4 or 5 sips from his glass. tell me, he said, is it true that Paris is so immoral as they say? Ignatius Gallagher made a Catholic gesture with his right arm. Every place is immoral, he said. Of course, you do find spicy bits in Paris. Go to one of the student balls, for example. That's lively, if you like, with the cocottes beginning to let themselves loose. You know what they are, I suppose. I've heard of them, said little Chandler. Ignatius Gallagher drank off his whiskey and shook his head. Ah, you may say what you like. There's no woman like the Parisienne for style, for go. Then it is an immoral city, said little Chandler, with a timid insistence. Compared with London or Dublin. London, said Ignatius Gallagher. It's a six of one and a half a dozen of the other. You ask Hogan, my boy. I'll show him a bit about London when he was. I showed him a bit of London when he was over there. He'd open your eye. Next.
I say, Tommy, don't make punch of that whiskey. Liquor up. No, really. Oh, come on. Another one won't do you any harm. What is it? The same again, I suppose. Well, all right. Francois, same again. Will you smoke, Tommy? Ignatius Gallagher produced his cigar case. The two friends lit their cigars and puffed at them in silence until their drinks were served. I'll tell you my opinion, said Ignatius Gallagher, emerging after some time from the clouds of smoke in which he had taken refuge. It's a rum world. Talk of immorality. I've heard of cases. What am I saying? I've known them. Cases of immorality. Ignatius Gallagher puffed thoughtfully at his cigar, and then, in a calm historian's tone, he proceeded to sketch for his friend some pictures of the corruption which was rife abroad. He summarized the vices of many capitals and seemed inclined to award the palm to Berlin. Some things he could not vouch for, his friends had told him, but of others he had personal experience. He spared neither rank nor caste. He revealed many of the secrets of religious houses on the continent and described some of the practices which were fashionable in high society, and ended by telling, with details, a story about an English duchess, a story which he knew to be true. Little Chandler was astonished. Ah, well, said Ignatius Gallagher, here we are in old jog-along Dublin, where nothing is known of such things. How dull you must find it, said little Chandler, after all the other places you've seen. Next.
Well, said Ignatius Gallagher, it's a relaxation to come over here, you know. And after all, it's the old country, as they say, isn't it? You can't help having a certain feeling for it. That's nature. But tell me something about yourself. Hogan told me that you had tasted the joys of connubial bliss 2 years ago, wasn't it? Little Chandler blushed and smiled. Yes, he said, I was married last May, 12 months. I hope it's not too late in the day to offer you my best wishes, said Ignatius Gallagher. I didn't know your address, or I'd have done so at the time. He extended his hand, which little Chandler took. Well, Tommy, he said, I wish you and yours every joy in life, old chap, tons of money, and may you never die till I shoot you. And that's the wish of a sincere friend, an old friend, you know that. I know that, said little Chandler. Any youngsters? Said Ignatius Gallagher. Little Chandler blushed again. We have one child, he said. Son or daughter? Little boy. Ignatius Gallagher slapped his friend sonorously on the back. Bravo, he said. I wouldn't doubt you, Tommy. Little Chandler smiled, looked confused at his glass, and bit his lower lip with 3 childishly white front teeth. I hope you'll spend an evening with us, he said, before you go back. My wife will be delighted to meet you. We can have a little music and... That's awfully, old chap, said Ignatius Gallagher. I'm sorry we didn't meet earlier, but I must leave tomorrow night. Tonight, perhaps. Awfully sorry, old chap. You see, I'm over here with another fellow. Clever young chap he is too, and we arranged to go to a little Card party only for that. Oh, in that case. But who knows? Said Ignatius Gallagher considerately. Next year I may take a little skip over here now that I've broken the ice. It's only a pleasure deferred. Very well, said little Chandler. The next time you come, we must have an evening together. That's agreed now, isn't it? Yes, that's agreed, said Ignatius Gallagher. Next year if I come, parole d'honneur. And to clinch the bargain, said little Chandler, we'll just have one more. Now, Ignatius Gallagher took out a large gold watch and looked at it. Is it to be the last? He said, because you know, I have an AP and
Exactly. Oh, yes, positively, said little Chandler. Very well then, said Ignatius Gallagher. Let us have another one as a Doris. That's good vernacular for a small whiskey, I believe. Little Chandler ordered the drinks. The blush which had risen to his face a few moments before was establishing itself. A trifle made him blush at any time, and now he felt warm and excited. 3 small whiskies had gone to his head, and Gallagher's strong cigar had confused his mind, for he was a delicate and abstinent person. The adventure of meeting Gallagher after 8 years, of finding himself at Gallagher and Corliss's, surrounded by lights and noise, of listening to Gallagher's stories, and of sharing for a brief space Gallagher's vagrant and triumphant life. He upset the equipoise of his sensitive nature. He felt acutely the contrast between his old life and his friends, and it seemed to him unjust. Gallagher was his inferior in birth and education. He was sure that he could do something better than his friend had ever done, or could he ever do, something higher than mere tawdry journalism if he only got the chance. What was it that stood in his way? His unfortunate timidity, his wish to vindicate himself in some way, to assert his manhood. He saw behind Gallagher's refusal of his invitation. Gallagher was only patronizing him by his friendliness, just as he was patronized Ireland by his visit. Next, please.
The
Thank you, Katrina.
The barman brought their drinks. Little Chandler pushed one glass towards his friend and took up the other boldly. Who knows, he said as they lifted their glasses. When you come next year, I may have the pleasure of wishing long life and happiness to Mr. and Mrs. Ignatius Gallagher. Ignatius Gallagher, in the act of drinking, closed one eye expressively over the rim of his glass. When he had drunk, he smacked his lips decisively, set his glass down, and said, "No blooming fear of that, my boy. I'm going to have my fling first and see a bit of life in the world before I put my head in the sack, if I ever do." "Someday you will," said little Chandler calmly. Ignatius Gallagher turned his orange tie and slate blue eyes full upon his friend. "You think so?" he said. "You'll put your head in the sack," repeated little Chandler, stoutly, "like everyone else, if you can find the girl." He had slightly emphasized his tone, and he was aware that he had betrayed himself. But though the color had heightened in his cheek, he did not flinch from his friend's gaze. Ignatius Gallagher watched him for a few moments and then said, "If it ever occurs, you may bet your bottom dollar there'll be no mooning and spooning about it. I mean to marry money. She'll have a good fat account at the bank, or she won't do for me." Little Chandler shook his head. "Why, man alive," said Ignatius Gallagher vehemently, "do you know what it is? I've only to say the word, and tomorrow I can have the woman and the cash. You don't believe it? Well, I know it. There are hundreds, what am I saying, thousands of rich Germans and Jews rotten with money that'd only be too glad. You wait a while, my boy. See if I don't play my cards properly. When I go about a thing, I mean business, I tell you. You just wait. Next, please."
He tossed his glass to his mouth, finished his drink, and laughed loudly. Then he looked thoughtfully before him and said in a calmer tone, "But I'm in no hurry. They can wait. I don't fancy tying myself up to one woman, you know." He imitated with his mouth the act of tasting, and made a wry face. Must get a bit stale, I should think, he said. Little Chandler sat in a room off the wall, holding a child in his arms. To save money, they kept no servant, but Annie's young sister Monica came for an hour or so in the morning and an hour or so in the evening to help. But Monica had gone home long ago. It was 9:15. Little Chandler had come home late for tea, and moreover, he had forgotten to bring Annie home the parcel of coffee from Burley's. Of course, she was in a bad humor and gave him short answers. She said she would do without any tea, but when it came near the time at which the shop at the corner closed, she decided to go out herself for 1/4 pound of tea and 2 pounds of sugar. She put the sleeping child deftly in his arms and said, "Here, don't wake it up." A little lamp with a white china shade stood upon the table, and its light fell over a photograph, which was enclosed in a frame of crumpled horn. It was Annie's photograph. Little Chandler looked at it, pausing at the thin, tight lips. She wore the pale blue summer blouse, which he had brought her home as a present one Saturday. It had cost him 10 and 11 pence, but what an agony of nervousness it had cost him. How he had suffered that day, waiting at the shop door until the shop was empty, standing at the counter and trying to appear at his ease, while the girl piled ladies' blouses before him, paying at the desk and forgetting to take up the odd penny of his change, being called back by the cashier, and finally striving to hide his blushes as he left the shop by examining the parcel to see if it was securely tied. When he brought the blouse home, Annie kissed him and said it was very pretty and stylish. But when she heard the price, she threw the blouse on the table and said it was a regular swindle to charge 10 and 11 pence for that. At first, she wanted to take it back, but when she tried it on, she was delighted with it, especially with the make of the sleeves, and kissed him and said he was very good to think of her. Next.
He looked coldly into the eyes of the photograph, and they answered coldly. Certainly they were pretty, and the face itself was pretty, but he found something mean in it. Why was it so unconscious and ladylike? The composure of the eyes irritated him. They repelled him and defied him. There was no passion in them, no rapture. He thought of what Gallagher had said about rich Jewesses. Those dark oriental eyes, he thought. How full they are of passion, of voluptuous longing. Why had he married the eyes in the photograph? He caught himself up at the question and glanced nervously around the room. He found something mean in the pretty furniture which he had bought for his house on the hire system. Annie had chosen it herself, and it reminded him of her. It was prim and pretty. A dull resentment against his life awoke within him. Could he not escape from his little house? Was it too late for him to try to live bravely like Gallagher? Could he go to London? There was the furniture still to be paid for. If he could only write a book and get it published, that might open the way for him. A volume of Byron's poems lay before him on the table. He opened it cautiously with his left hand, lest he should awaken the child, and began to read the first poem in the book. Hushed are the winds, and still the evening gloom. Not ere a zephyr wanders through the grove, whilst I return to view my Margaret's tomb, and scatter flowers on the dust I love. Next.
He paused. He felt the rhythm of the verse about him in the room. How melancholy it was. Could he, too, write like that, express the melancholy of a soul in verse? There were so many things he wanted to describe. His sensation of a few hours before on Grattan Bridge, for example, if he could get back again into that mood. The child awoke and began to cry. He turned from the page and tried to hush it, but it would not be hushed. He began to rock it to and fro in his arms, but his wailing cry grew keener. He rocked it faster while his eyes began to read the second stanza. Within this narrow cell reclines her clay, that clay where once It was useless. He couldn't read. He couldn't do anything. The wailing of the child pierced the drum of his ear. It was useless, useless. He was a prisoner for life. His arms trembled with anger, and suddenly, bending to the child's face, he shouted, "Stop! Next!"
The child stopped for an instant, had a spasm of fright, and began to scream. He jumped up from his chair and walked hastily up and down the room with the child in his arms. It began to sob piteously, losing its breath for 4 or 5 seconds, then bursting out anew. The thin walls of the room echoed the sound. He tried to soothe it, but it sobbed more convulsively. He looked at the contracted and quivering face of the child and began to be alarmed. He counted 7 sobs without a break between them and caught the child to his breast in fright. If it died. The door burst open and a young woman ran in, panting. Anne.
What is it? What is it? She cried. The child, hearing its mother's voice, broke out into a paroxysm of sobbing. It's nothing, and it's nothing, he began to cry. She flung her parcels on the floor and snatched the child from him. What have you done to him? She cried, glaring into his face. Little Chandler sustained for one moment the gaze of her eyes, and his heart closed together as he met the hatred in them. Oh dear. He began to stammer. It's nothing. He began to cry. I couldn't. I didn't do anything. What? Giving no heed to him, she began to walk up and down the room, clasping the child tightly in her arms and murmuring, "My little man, my little manny. What, you frightened love. There now, love, there now. Lamb bam bam, Mama's little lamb of the world. There now." Little Chandler felt his cheeks suffused with shame, and he stood back out of the lamplight. He listened while the bosom of the child, sobbing, grew less and less, and tears of remorse started to his eyes. Oh, God, very sad.
Yeah.
Oh, so funny. Oh dear. This is a really good example of what you were saying before about the paralysis in Dubliners.
Yeah.
You know, little
Yeah.
Chandler didn't take his chance, and now he is he's no hope of getting
Yeah.
out. And it's really sad. You know, when he was walking over to that Corliss place, sometimes, however, he courted the causes of his fear. You know, by going down side streets or places that he probably shouldn't have, just so that to get some bit of excitement into his life. He chose the darkest and narrowest of streets. Pardon?
And the description of the poor little, the vagrant children, the poorness of the people walking through, yeah.
Really sad.
And money crops up again where Gallagher says, "I'm going to marry for money," you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, both Gallagher and his wife treat him the same, just slightly different.
Yeah.
I mean, he hangs out with people who belittle him.
Yeah.
I mean, using these admittedly short examples, you know, but Gallagher is, you know, he's so excited to see Ignatius Gallagher, but he really should have avoided him if he wasn't going to stand up to him at all. I mean, Gallagher just.
Yeah.
One of my favorite lines is, Gallagher was only patronizing him by his friendliness. just as he was patronizing Ireland by his visit. And that,
Oh,
that really, to me, sort of sums up Gallagher.
Yeah.
Yeah, coming home talking big,
Mhm.
talking bigger than it really is.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, and wearing an orange tie.
Yeah, the orange tie.
That's not an Irish color.
Not Republican.
Okay, that's okay. I get it.
Mhm.
But at the same time, you can see we talked to Duncan about a prison before closing in on the last story. I presume they're in rented accommodation, and they've also borrowed money for furniture.
Mhm.
They're paying back a loan and paying interest. Like they have nothing in the world and no prospect of ever. It's a somewhat modern story in Dublin, that era is coming back.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, this might not be relative, but this is actually what's happening here in the United States. That people are ever since the 70s, when credit cards, when easy credit came, increasing percentages of people are totally trapped in debt.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Really, the First World War represented a time when there was leveling up, as we talk about in this part of the world. It was possible for ordinary people to own a small house and not always be paying rent for, you could have a house like I have from my old age, and don't have to work on rent. And but that era has come to an end. It came to an end with the end of the savings and loan type banks. And they just became part of the great slush of funds around the planet. And we're going back towards more feudal times, where half a dozen young people seem to own most of the wealth of, you get an IT company that's worth all more than all the motor companies put together. That sort of thing. And a guy who kind of maybe wants to visit the moon or something, those type of characters. And they're the new feudal lords, sort of. So it's, but anyway, I've wandered away there from the story, but it's just that
it's actually part of the story. But I mean, in the personal part, I mean, the one thing I notice here is that with just a few exceptions in the story, Gallagher is always Ignatius Gallagher.
Yes.
And Chandler is always little Chandler or Tommy.
Yeah. He's diminutive.
The little Chandler struck a note with me because I have frequently been called Little Lois, and it's irking.
Yeah.
Kick him in the shins, Lois.
So,
yeah. Well, I mean, not on that. Everything that Ignatius Gallagher says to Chandler is talking from a high position to a low position. I'm in Paris. I hang out with all these people, and Chandler puts up with it.
Yeah. It's funny. I have had a school friend who, like that, went to London and sort of got into business there. And I remember in my 20s him coming back to Dublin. He talked a great game, but it didn't particularly bother me because I didn't really believe it. Sort of it's very easy for some guy to come back, and he buys a nice outfit and wanders around, buys a few drinks and talks telephone numbers.
Talks big.
Money. Yeah. It's an easy thing to do. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There,
Yeah, but I think for little Chandler, it just
yeah,
exacts. I'm trying to think of the word. All his problems, because he knows he's made a mistake by tying himself down and not reading his poetry books and even the
yeah,
basics in his life. And then he obviously also believes Ignatius Gallagher, everything he says. Which is big.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, you were lucky you had more sense.
yeah.
Mhm.
Ignatius Gallagher is the prime suspect for Martha Clifford in Ulysses.
What, that he is the pen pal? That he's
He is Martha Clifford, you see? And based on, oh, where is it? Is it in Ithaca? You get this equation. Uh, MC is to what does it say? As LB is to HF, as Leopold Bloom
okay.
MC.
Okay.
It's a sort of a kind of almost an equation, but it's not really an equation. But if you various ways of solving it, and you come up with
Mhm.
letters IG,
Oh,
it's disputed because the guy who figured it out slightly wrong in his maths. But you get your IG, and the only character with IG initials is Ignatius Geller.
It's gonna-
So there are there are kind of other reasons why it might be him,
Ah,
and
okay.
uh,
Okay.
he is the prime suspect.
Okay. So, okay.
And having heard him there, he's quite capable of writing that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I love the way Little Chandler, refers to low journalism. He's going to write books of poetry and things, not going to involve dirty his hands with journalism.
Right. Right.
What do we think the title means?
A little cloud?
Mm.
No, it's some of the commentaries it mentioned is taken from the Bible. There's a phrase in the Bible in Kings or somewhere that mentions.
Well, I'll have to look up that biblical reference. I'm trying to figure out what is the little cloud.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It's melancholy, isn't it?
It's in 1 Kings, the Israelites under Ahab turned from the worship of God to the worship of Baal. And it goes on. This quote then from the Bible: after 2 wasteland years, Elijah returns to confront Ahab and demonstrates the spiritual potency of the prophets of Baal who are slain to restore the faith in the Lord among the Israelites. So, behold, there ariseth a little cloud out to the sea, like a man's hand. Don't ask me what that means. The first, the
yeah.
first, the first news of coming of rain is brought by Elijah's servant. Behold, there ariseth a little cloud out to the sea, like a man's hand.
Ah,
I think it's like the Bible. You can read anything into it you want.
So is it like bad news? A portent of bad news?
I presume they're waiting for rain or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, 2 years of wasteland years. The servant sees a little cloud out to sea and says the
So
rain.
that would be a good thing. If they're waiting for rain and they see a cloud.
Yeah, it is. It's good news for the Israelites, but I don't know. I don't know how that relates to this story.
yeah, I would have thought that a little cloud is more like the melancholy mood that
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
follows
I agree.
Gallagher, that he's beaten down.
yeah,
So
It's like Little Abner. I don't know if you remember Little Abner.
Yeah,
He
the
had a
shmoo.
character who
The
always had a
shmoo.
black cloud above his head with
yeah,
lightning coming out of it.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Because Gallagher seems to me like a big cloud over
Yeah.
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 Little Chandler. I suppose Little Chandler and Little Cloud, LC and LC.
Mhm. That's
I don't
true. Yeah.
know.
yeah,
He's only a
Yeah,
little cloud.
exactly.
I think he's just a small time operator, basically, and he's a little cloud.
Um,
I don't know.
and he doesn't have any confidence or anything. She's constantly getting embarrassed, even when he speaks,
yeah,
tells him
Right.
that he has a child and a thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
Well, he has surrounded himself. I mean, just based upon these examples, he surrounds himself with people who put him down.
Yeah.
I mean, he'll never be able to write anything
Yeah.
until he straightens out his relationships with people, even if it's just, to tell them to, screw off. I got something to do here.
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't put a whole heavy bet on his marriage surviving very long.
Mm.
No, it doesn't sound good, the
Do
Oliver
you think?
Jones. What'd you
Do you
do
think?
to him?
Do you think he was bamboozled into this marriage, like in the last story?
Mm.
It was possible, but kind of he just probably something he drifted into. Well, the madness took hold of him, I suppose.
Was that not a thing that was expected of men and women and at that time? I mean, that you got married and the marriages may not have been successful, but the
Yeah,
people largely stayed together because what
yeah,
are the choices?
Right.
yeah. He's 32, so kind of you could see someone said you're nearly 28 now. You'd want to get a move on, sort of. So he kind of just did it. It was like it seemed, the photograph of his wife, with the blouse and
Mm.
uh, not exactly wild poetic love match, you know.
Hmm.
Mm. But
There's also, um, Joyce said, sorry, go ahead.
no, you go ahead, Tom. Beg your pardon.
Where again it says in some of the commentaries there that Joyce said, he said in his letter that one page of a little cloud gave him more pleasure than all his verses. Yeah, so he liked the story immensely. It was the last story he wrote before The Dead. It was the final story before he wrote The Dead. So he put it back there in that part.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, because I felt there was a lot of himself in there. I just thought it was my own reading of it that
Yeah.
almost describing another self that he might have been.
That he might have been, yes.
He
That's
hadn't done the brave thing with Nora, and
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, because that was a very radical break. I mean, and by going abroad with Nora, that put their relationship on a totally different footing
yeah,
than
yeah,
most. Although it was not a perfect relationship, it was one where, they had to look to each other to
yeah,
survive
yeah,
and and to thrive, and they had their good times.
yeah,
They
and
definitely had their good times and their productive times together.
yeah. So
Where, yeah.
like he could have just hung around Dublin and married his best friend's sister or something, and at 31. So yeah.
I thought of Joyce also. I'm just trying to find it there, where little Chandler is describing Ignatius Gallagher, and he says, of course, he did mix with rakish set of fellows at the time, drank freely and borrowed money on all sides, which reminds me of James Joyce, himself. Yeah,
Yeah, himself. Yeah. But that idea of trying to write a sentence, trying to get a thought,
yeah,
that struck me. That's how Joyce felt when he looked at a blank sheet of page for 4 hours and nothing happened. Sort of, that awful feeling of not being able to get anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's why I felt it was just personal, that might have been. Mm. Yeah, it's the Dubliners as a stories of people who are incapable of escaping from
yeah.
situations they need to escape from.
There's a great satisfaction in reading the stories, isn't there? I
Mm.
mean, they're not heroic stories, so they're very human stories. And Joyce always had, very human in everything he wrote, like, you know. But they give you a kind of tremendous satisfaction reading them, I think.
Yeah, I was very glad last week when you pointed out the poetry that is within apparently
Yeah.
some sentences.
Yeah.
And that's definitely there. You know, the child hearing his mother's voice broke out in a paroxysm of sobbing. Oh, you can see it.
Yes. Yes.
And of course, it's every male's fear that you're left to mind a child. You know, I remember this. I remember my sister's leaving me with a child. You know, as if I knew,
Yes, I've been in that position a few times
you know,
myself.
and you're just hoping
Yeah.
nothing happens. Just, you know, because you're not sure
What do I do if?
you know, if it coughs, should you call the cops? Should you call the emergencies? You know, you know, and it ends up that the child has kind of just given one cough, and there are two ambulances outside the door when the you know, it really is a male nightmare, you know, until you've had your own children and you have some idea which end to hold, you know.
Yeah, it's a learning curve.
Yeah,
It takes time. It's plus of course the child tends to want the mother too, because the mother means food
oh yeah,
and all that sort of stuff. And the mother has to go. Not all mothers become mothers easily, but they definitely they have to face up to the fact that there's this child and they have to spend time with it, and it's squalling and bawling and you know gets upset after every feeding and all that, but they get it worked out.
yeah. Annie is on a learning curve too, so they're yeah,
I think one part here I find it interesting. Apparently Joyce did admire Byron somewhat, but I find it interesting that little Chandler uh, goes to Byron, that he opens up a
yeah,
Byron poem, which is completely other than his life, completely other than all of his experience. This is just something that he learned in school, I think, that was supposed to be good poetry.
yeah,
Although it says that Joyce admired Byron, I can't think of anything that Joyce ever wrote that does anything like Byron did at all. Joyce's writing is so close to the ground and human experience. Well, Byron is always.
yeah, yeah. He's a completely different voice. He's like,
He's a completely different voice, and here I'll make a radical statement, just because I like to make at least one radical statement. I think that Byron is Ignatius Gallagher.
oh yes,
You know, I mean, Ignatius is like, well, I've been to Paris and I've been to Berlin, and
yeah,
oh, you should see these risque things that I do, and
yeah,
it's just marvelous, and won't you have another drink? And
yeah,
that there's some of Byron that I like very much, but Byron is very bombastic.
yeah, yeah.
Isn't there a scene in The Poet of an Artist where Joyce is walking home or walking along, and two of his fellow schoolmates come upon him and they kind of catch him and hold him.
Yeah.
And they're asking him, who is the best poet?
Yes, yes.
And I don't know, I think, do they mention Byron? Or they're trying to insist that it's Byron and he won't give in or something like that.
Yeah,
But there is something that
There is some, yes.
Yeah.
I think there may be a little. Yeah, I should look that up. Not now, but
Yeah.
Well, I want to know who paid for the drinks.
Me too.
I noticed you picked up on the fact that it was at a certain point in the drinking where the drink had finally taken hold of little Chandler,
Hmm.
and he changed his tone all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I love the way.
I'm sorry. I just just a few minutes ago, my audio came on. My video is not on. But to me, Gallagher doesn't have great talent, or I don't think he's got the achievement that he's portraying or insinuating. I think he's a scammer, and I'm sure little Chandler paid for the drinks. Um, yeah, I don't think that he was that interested in little Chandler. He just wanted a soft touch for the drinks that preceded his evening plans.
Is there any sentence that indicates that little Chandler paid?
No, it's not. It's a break in the type, and
Okay.
he's the thing is he goes home. He's at home in the next paragraph with the baby, having forgotten to get the coffee, tea, and sugar for his wife.
Mm-hmm. Which is probably also a
But
result of his drinks.
Yeah.
you know, the other thing too is that he might think that, oh well, if he had not married and gone off like Gallagher, he would be a significant poet. But when I've read this, I don't get um, I don't think he has talent. And certainly at his age, he should have had a portfolio of some depth.
So
Just
you're referring to little Chandler at this point, right?
little Chandler. I don't think little Chandler
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
is as bright as it would take to be a significant poet.
Yeah. There's certainly nothing to show
Yeah.
at all. Quite the opposite, really. That he's.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's insincere, and he hasn't really kept in touch with Chandler's marriage and child, and
Oh yeah.
I don't know.
And he's definitely not committing to a dinner engagement with them.
Yeah,
Next,
yeah.
that's it's kind of sort of his big nightmare is that he will
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's not good for the evening.
Yeah, yeah,
It is a sad story because it seems to me like the child will be the same as little Chandler, that history will repeat itself in
oh, you can
the
see it
life. Yeah.
coming.
Hmm.
Yeah,
I sort of see the child's crying and screaming to be little Chandler crying and screaming.
Oh, as a child?
No, as himself now.
Yeah.
It's a to me a vision of he's holding this baby who is screaming and yelling, and that's exactly how Chandler feels.
Yeah.
his inner child.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it says he goes off to cry.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yes, tears of remorse.
Yeah.
Well, there's the three, his three social interactions, or one are with Ignatius Gallagher,
Yeah,
the other is with his wife, and the third is with his child. And in all three, he's the put upon person.
Mhm. Right. And then
And
you were talking earlier about Gallagher looking to marry for money, but that's
Mm.
exactly what the story was with women and their money. When they got married, the money went to the husband. It's
yeah,
called coverture. It was true in England and true in America. The idea was that the marriage made the woman one with the husband, and the husband was the one who took care of everything.
yeah,
And it wasn't until the marriage dissolved that she recovered any economic rights.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. That's came with the Normans into England and
Okay.
then into here as well. Yeah,
Yeah.
Um, so
But women couldn't acquire anything, couldn't benefit from any earnings they had in a marriage.
yeah, you see that with Molly, that Molly can't write a check, you know.
Mhm,
She said I
mhm.
could forge his signature.
It's quite the story of women's economic suppression and the women's rights that
That's great that you point that out, because that again go back to Harriet Weaver, and
yeah.
the uh, the egoist,
Mhm.
the Free Woman magazine,
Right, right.
that it really is giving the suffragettes' point of view.
Hmm.
Uh,
But see, yeah, as a single woman, she had the rights to her to business and her
uh,
finances. There's
uh,
another one in England named Angela Burdett Coutts, who in the 1830s inherited so much money she was more wealthy than the monarchy.
yeah,
And
well,
yeah, and she didn't marry, but she teamed up with Dickens, and they did a lot of social programming, including the Urania House, which was to help women off the streets learn domestic skills and go off to Australia.
mm,
But anyway, she's an interesting
Hmm.
character because
mm,
Angela she's got big money, and Dickens helps her with spending it, but then Dickens is going through a separation from his wife and she doesn't like that, so that breaks up their friendship.
makes up
And then yeah, and then
mm, yeah.
yeah, and then and the end of the story is that she's 67, and there was a provision that if she ever married somebody from America, I think it was America, she would have to forfeit a big percent of the bundle of money. So she marries a man who's in his 20s,
Yeah.
and they have a very happy marriage. Who
When she's
but
67, she marries a
yeah,
man in his
yeah,
20s,
and he's been
and
managing some of her accounts,
she loses her money at that particular point,
a percent of it,
a percent of
a
it.
percent. Hmm.
Yeah.
It's either a third or two-thirds that she loses, but
Hmm.
she's got enough to take care of both of them, and they have a
Hmm.
happy marriage. Mhm.
Hmm.
It's true. I remember when I was starting out, it was impossible for a single woman to get a mortgage for
Oh,
to
yes.
buy an
That's
apartment.
right. That's
And
right.
in fact, it was the first house I bought when I was single, but I had great difficulty in getting mortgage approval because I was not married.
Uh-huh.
And the salesman, sort of after kind of several goes and rejections, he said, can you not get someone to say you're getting married? I got a friend who
Oh,
said,
yeah.
we were getting married, and I got my mortgage
Sheesh.
in my own name, just on the basis, and kind of sort of, I was never let forget that by that particular lady who now lives in France and is married happily, thankfully.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But if you could see that kind of marriage was compulsory.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it proves that you were stable, right? That
Well,
you
that
were,
was it. Yeah, yeah. If you had a job
and that you would honor your job because you had a wife to support or whatever.
yeah, yeah. And of course, that's true of our last man, Bob Doran, as well. That on the plus side, if he had a wife, it locks him into his job security. Uh, you know,
Hmm.
so I remember like my first job, which was in a big organization. I didn't last very long. Went off to do other things, but there was a different rate of pay for a married man.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes,
Oh,
because
yes.
he had responsibilities.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I'm sure that's all gone now, I presume. Like,
Oh,
yeah. No,
it's
there's
Oh,
been
actually,
a
it
lot of
actually can be the opposite now.
yeah,
It can be the opposite, that actually
yeah.
single people have a little bit of an edge these days because they can be moved around.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they will work hours that a married person would find more difficult. I mean, this is how things have kind of flipped to a
Mhm.
certain extent.
Yeah.
But
They,
yeah, I mean,
all the married people will be wanting holidays to coincide with schools.
well, and they'll have children, and they
Well,
all have to.
yeah, where a single person will take what they get.
Mhm. Wow.
Well, they would express it as they would have greater flexibility and more ability to spend longer hours at
Yeah.
work. But
Yeah.
I mean, I'm old enough in America, and I'm sure I can get other testaments here, that in the '60s when credit cards came out, I mean, women had trouble getting
That's right.
checking accounts,
Hmm.
Yeah.
credit
Hmm.
cards,
Yeah.
mortgages. I mean, I don't think that most younger people realize how new all this stuff
Yeah.
is.
And I have a friend who was a bookkeeper, a place where I had as a client. I was just friendly with this lady who's my own age, and she lives in rented accommodation. And she says, when I started out, I couldn't buy a place. Now
Hmm.
I'm expected to have bought one, by
Hmm.
society and so on. So she eventually got fixed up with a place through a
Mhm.
religious charity, due to her Protestant religion and that sort of thing. But like there was no way as a single woman in her 50s she could get a mortgage. There's no way a single person, anyone in the 50s is going to get a mortgage unless they're doing some fantastic salary. And
Mhm.
but people didn't want to know, as you say, Duncan, like the generation didn't know. People didn't realize. They just thought that she was feckless as a young person. Didn't realize they
Mhm.
weren't allowed.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
how the world has changed.
Well,
I
we're all
must,
acquainted with it. Mhm.
I must run to my bank now and put a check in there before the creditor gets there. So I'll
Yeah.
Okay.
the
This is
checking and
strange. Well, let
Well,
me.
we're very glad that you have a.
Thank
We're very glad that you have a checking
I
account.
have the check, but I got to run to the bank. So thanks a
Okay.
lot. I
Right.
enjoyed the
Okay.
readings, but I don't know what happened to my video. I'll try to find
Uh,
out.
we see.
Okay. Well, I hope you get the problem solved.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Thanks.
I've had
Yep.
a very good time, and I have
Yeah, me too.
to go back to portrait and try to figure out what the boys were giving
Hmm.
Stephen
Yeah.
Dedalus a hard time
Yeah.
about which writer.
Yeah.
Okay, guys.
Thank
Okay.
you.